Hi friends, you know the old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. What happens if it is broke? Like the Federal Reserve. Who's going to fix it? How is it going to get fixed? And what's broken? We believe the current monetary regime, which is known as an abundant reserves model, is one of the key reasons why we find ourselves in the economic and inflationary situation that we're in. So let me see if I can explain it in a very clear and straightforward way. Back in 2007, the Federal Reserve operated under what was known as a scarcity reserves model. Simply means they didn't believe, as the Federal Reserve, remember, the institution that can simply print money, that they needed to have a large, abundant cash flow, or reserves. So in 2007, the Federal Reserve had about $850 billion in reserves. They required banks to take about $1 out of every $9 and put in reserves. So banks were required to take about $1 out of every $9, 8.8 to be exact, put in reserves, and that left the Federal Reserve with about $850 billion in excess. Now let's fast forward. As of this year, the Federal Reserve requires banks to keep $1 out of every $2.50 in reserves, and they've got almost $9 trillion in reserves. What in the world is the institution that can make money, print money, and determine money doing with $9 trillion sitting in the bank? And to make matters worse, because they require so much reserves for banks, they are now paying, meaning the federal government via the Federal Reserve is now paying private banks last year nearly $200 billion just to have cash. It makes absolutely no sense. The current monetary regime to print a bunch of money, require banks to sit on a bunch of money, and then arbitrarily determine an interest rate that you then have to pay private banks from taxpayers' dollars just to have the first two in place. It's nonsensical. Not only does the abundant reserve model not need to be in place, but the Fed funds rate, which is what happens every time they raise interest rates, which is about 4.5%, isn't actually determined by anything. Meaning, if banks didn't need excess reserves, they didn't need to borrow from one another, and the Federal Reserve didn't keep so much on hand, then they could set the federal funds rate at zero. Because if nobody needs to borrow money and nobody has excess money that they need to lend out, what's the interest rate? It's zero. So the fact that 12 men and women sit in a room and arbitrarily determine an interest rate of 4.5% based off of no mathematical or economical reasoning other than their interpretation of data, which is a whole separate conversation, and then the fact that they're paying taxpayer dollars on those reserves that they're mandating. It is an absolute window into what we believe should be a no confidence position inside the Federal Reserve and the way they're currently operating. I had a client ask me recently, what can change your economic outlook about the next 6 to 9 months about recession and the market falling further than it currently is? And the short answer is nothing. And I say that sort of tongue in cheek because really the only thing that can keep that from happening is an absolute reversal in monetary policy, monetary mandate, Federal Reserve behavior, and their understanding, interpretation, and application of economic and financial data, which we believe is not going to happen. So as we've said before, we believe the Federal Reserve is going to raise rates until they break something, What we think they break is the U.S. economy, which we believe is needed. This is the chicken coming home to roost from absurd COVID and pandemic economic policies. But the fact that the current Federal Reserve operates the way that it does means that while we are going to go into likely recession and we believe a recovery and likely a long and strong bull market is on the other side of that, we've also got bigger issues, which is a questionable monetary regime and policy in the Federal Reserve and decision making by those policymakers themselves. So, what can keep us from heading into the iceberg as the Titanic? A new captain, but that seems unlikely. So for now, we've got to prepare, we've got to plan, and we've got to get ready to be able to navigate the current monetary policy and regime that we're in. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.